Salesforce just posted one of the best years in its history. In fiscal 2026, it brought in $41.5 billion in revenue, up 10% with record cash flow to match. A few months later, it beat Wall Street again. This is not a company in trouble. It is the dominant name in customer software. And yet, by the middle of 2026, its stock had fallen by roughly a third to a 3-year low, erasing tens of billions in market value. So there is a strange split here. The business is setting records. The share price is acting like something is broken. The company is this healthy. Why is the market so nervous? Because investors are no longer judging Salesforce on what it earned last year. They are questioning something deeper, the way it makes money in the first place. For 25 years, Salesforce sold software the simplest way imaginable. One license per person, billed every year. That single idea made it one of the richest software companies on earth. And in 2026, it stopped feeling like a safe bet. Why would one of the richest software companies on earth spend billions trying to dismantle the very model that made it rich? In 1999, buying business software was a heavy, expensive ritual. You bought it the way you would buy industrial equipment, a large licensing fee up front, servers in your own building, months of consultants to wire it together, then a stream of maintenance bills for the privilege. The king of that world was Siebel Systems, built entirely around selling enterprise software the old, costly way. Salesforce refused to play along. Its pitch was almost insultingly simple. Do not install anything, just open a web browser. The company stamped the word software inside a red circle with a line through it. No software. The cheaper, lighter, faster answer to everything Siebel stood for. It helped that founder Mark Benioff had spent years inside Oracle. He knew exactly how the incumbents made their money, and he aimed at the part customers resented most, the cost and the complexity. But the real bet was never the product. It was the plumbing underneath and the way you paid for it. Salesforce ran on multi-tenant architecture, one shared system serving every customer at once instead of a separate copy for each. That made it far cheaper to deliver, and on top of it sat the real revolution, a subscription. Instead of one enormous purchase, you paid a recurring fee per user to keep the lights on. That shift sounds small. It was anything but. Software went from something you bought to something you rented, a utility billed by the seat indefinitely. In fact, it worked almost too well. A model that works creates its own pressure, not to maintain it, but to compound it. The genius of selling by the seat was never just the low entry price. It was the math that came after. Salesforce could get into a company through the smallest door. One team, a handful of users, one department tracking its deals. The logic was deliberate. Make the first yes almost effortless, then get inside. Because once you were inside, the relationship flipped. The data lived in Salesforce. The workflows lived in Salesforce. The daily habits of an entire sales floor lived in Salesforce. Ripping it out meant retraining people and risking the one system the business actually ran on. So at renewal, the question was rarely whether to stay. It was how much more to buy. The industry calls this land and expand, but the strategy underneath was sharper than the slogan. Build the switching cost so high that growth becomes the path of least resistance, for the customer and for Salesforce alike. It worked. Between fiscal 2021 and fiscal 2026, Salesforce's revenue roughly doubled, from $21 billion to $41.5 billion. CRM stopped being a market it competed in and became home turf. But this is where a quieter decision starts to matter. For years, Salesforce optimized for one thing above all others. Not margins, not efficiency. Top-line growth, the number Wall Street rewarded most. Benioff was candid that this was the priority. Growth was the scoreboard and Salesforce meant to win it. The problem with that scoreboard is arithmetic. An installed base only has so many seats left to sell. To keep growing, Salesforce needed new things to sell and new ground to sell them on. It could build that territory slowly, in-house, or buy it. Salesforce, almost by temperament, chose to buy. If the last decade of Salesforce had a sound, it was the sound of a checkbook opening. But the spending had a thesis and a name, Customer 360. The idea was to sell a company not just customer software, but its entire system. Sales, service, marketing, analytics, all on one platform. The more of your business ran inside Salesforce, the harder leaving became. So Salesforce bought the stack. In 2018, it paid roughly $6.5 billion for MuleSoft, the plumbing that let all this software talk to itself. A year later, $15.7 billion for Tableau, the analytics layer. Each deal filled a gap, and each gap filled was one more reason a customer could never quite leave. In late 2020, Salesforce agreed to buy Slack for about $27.7 billion, closing the largest acquisition in its history in 2021. On paper, an odd fit, a workplace chat app inside a customer software company. But the logic was never about what Slack did. It was about who Slack was fighting. That enemy was Microsoft, which had been bundling its own chat tool, Teams, into the Office subscription millions of companies already paid for. It was effectively giving the tool away, threatening to own the layer where work actually happens. Slack had pushed back hard enough to file a formal antitrust complaint in Europe over that bundling. So Salesforce was not buying growth. It was buying a wall, a foothold in collaboration, and a way to fight a rival big enough to bundle Salesforce itself into irrelevance. Benioff's logic was blunt. To compete with a giant that sells everything, you have to sell everything too. The irony was hard to miss. The company that won by killing complexity was now building one of the most sprawling empires in software. And every empire eventually sends a bill. For years, growth justified everything. As long as the top-line number climbed, Wall Street looked past what it cost. Around 2022, that patience ran out. Some of the bill was simple math. Salesforce had spent more than $50 billion on acquisitions, and the empire was expensive to run, with margins thin for a software company its size. The rest was harder to measure. Critics and customers argued the deals never fully knit together, that Slack and Tableau still felt bolted onto the side rather than woven in. To be clear, the complaint was about cost and integration, not failure. The products kept growing. The problem was that buying this much, this fast, had made the lean disruptor heavy. In October 2022, the activist investor Starboard Value disclosed a stake with a blunt message. The wrong mix of growth and profit, money left on the table. Then Elliott took a multi-billion-dollar position. Third point, inclusive capital and Value Act followed. For the first time as a public company, Salesforce was on defense. Not against Siebel, not against Microsoft, against its own shareholders. The reversal was fast. On January 4th, 2023, Salesforce cut about 10% of its workforce, roughly 7,000 jobs. It refreshed the board, gave a seat to an activist, and shut down the committee that had powered the acquisition spree. The deal-making was over, and the single goal, growth, became a new one. Profitable growth. This was a real change in what kind of company Salesforce is. Benioff, who had spent 2 decades chasing the top line, conceded the point. Margins climbed toward the mid-30s, and cash increasingly went to shareholders through buybacks instead of the next big deal. The disruptor had grown up into the disciplined, cash-returning incumbent it once defined itself against. But discipline only fixed the old problem. It did nothing about the new one. Because just as Salesforce got better than ever at selling seats, a new technology arrived and asked whether those seats needed to exist at all. Salesforce did not just sell software, it sold a seat at the table. And the question now hanging over the company is how many seats that table still needs. Salesforce sells 1 license per person every year. That assumes a human is in the seat, a salesperson logging calls, a rep closing tickets, a marketer running campaigns. The whole business rests on a quiet assumption that companies need people to do this work and that those people need logins. Artificial intelligence puts a question mark on that assumption. The new generation is not a smarter search box. These are agents. Software that takes a task and carries it out from start to finish. Resolve the ticket, update the record, run the workflow, no one in the seat. And if an agent can do the job a licensed human used to do, an uncomfortable question follows for the company that charges by the human. How many seats does a business actually need? That is the threat behind the falling stock. Not that Salesforce makes bad software, but that its best customers might, over time, simply need fewer licenses. For a company whose growth engine is selling more seats into accounts it already owns, that is the engine itself in question. Salesforce sees this as clearly as Wall Street does. Rather than wait for someone else to break the seat model, it decided to do it first. That product is Agentforce, its platform for deploying the very AI agents that threaten the old model. And it does not sell by the seat, it sells by the task. Salesforce introduced a new unit, the agentic work unit, one discrete job an agent completes. Customers pay for the work the agents do, not the heads logged in. If the future bills by the action instead of the person, Salesforce wants to own that meter too. The early numbers are real. Agentforce reached $1.2 billion in annual recurring revenue, up 205% year over year. Combined with its data products, total AI and data revenue reached nearly $3.4 billion, with 3.8 billion agentic work units delivered. For a product this young, that is fast. But here you have to keep your head, because the honest version requires holding two facts at once. The first, $1.2 billion sounds enormous, but against a company doing more than $41 billion in revenue, it is roughly 3% of the business. The other 98% is still the old per-seat model. Agentforce is not rescuing Salesforce yet. It is a promising start on a very long road. The second is the question the entire investment case turns on. When a customer buys Agentforce, are they adding it on top of their existing seats, which makes Salesforce more money? Or replacing seats with agents, shrinking the license bill while the agent bill grows? Is consumption expanding the pie or eating it? The evidence points both ways. More than half of Agentforce's bookings come from existing customers, which the optimistic read calls expansion. The skeptical read is that those same customers, agents in hand, will need fewer human seats over time, and the two could cancel out. Some analysts have flagged early signs of seat-down sell pressure, where accounts renew for fewer licenses than before. For now, that is a watch item, not a proven collapse. Anyone who says they know how it nets out is guessing. What is not in doubt is the urgency. You can read it in Salesforce's behavior. In June 2026, it agreed to spend $3.6 billion acquiring Fin, the AI customer service company formerly known as Intercom, buying agent capability rather than building it. It committed hundreds of millions to Anthropic's AI models, and it executed a $25 billion accelerated buyback, funded partly by new debt, a record profitable company borrowing to buy back its own stock while the market doubts its future. Step back, and you can see what Benioff is doing. He is taking the most profitable, most reliable model his company has, the per-seat license that made Salesforce rich, and he is deliberately undercutting it. On purpose. On his own timeline. Before a competitor or the market forces his hand. Salesforce is not dying. It is doing something more dangerous. It is trying to kill its own best business model before someone else gets the chance. So what do you take away from this beyond one software company having a complicated year? The first, the moat eventually becomes the wall. Salesforce won by building the most complete, most interconnected platform in its industry, and for years that breadth was its strength. But the very thing that made it impossible to leave made it heavy and slow when the ground shifted. A moat does not only keep enemies out, it can fence you in. The second, fundamentals and story can come apart, and the market trades the story. By the numbers, Salesforce is doing better than ever. Record revenue, record cash flow, and the stock fell by a third anyway. Share prices are not a verdict on last year, they are a bet on the next 10. When strong results and a falling stock contradict each other, the gap between them is the story. The third, and the one to keep, is the self-disruption tax. Sooner or later, every dominant company faces the same brutal choice. Keep milking the model that made it rich, or attack that model before someone else does. Salesforce chose to attack. That is almost certainly the right instinct, but it is never free. You spend years and billions tearing down a machine that still works perfectly, betting you can build the next one before the old revenue runs out. The cost is paid now, in real money. The payoff is uncertain and lives in the future. That is the tax. This is not the end of Salesforce. It has the cash, the customers, the data, and the distribution to navigate this brilliantly. But it is no longer the easy, obvious winner it was for 20 years. It is making an expensive, high-stakes bet against its own past. And the question, from here, is not whether Salesforce was a great company. It is whether the model that made it great can survive what comes next. If you've got cash to burn, welcome to the Bagholder Association. And if you'd rather keep yours, subscribe. We'll watch billion-dollar companies burn theirs instead.